don't go into more detail on security of the electronic health record and those types of things in HIT 221, which is your computer applications course in the program. But I want to touch on a few things in this particular chapter in the book. And I think we've pointed this out time after time, that most institutional health care providers and ancillary service providers, so basically health care providers, as well as, not just in hospitals, but in large physician practices, have converted over to electronic health records and electronic financial support systems. And so this is coming to pass, but maybe not even most, but many have, or they're partially there. They don't have a totally electronic health record, but they may be using the electronic financial support. I mean, all the billing and everything's done electronically. And so there's kind of a mixture here, but that's the direction in which we're headed. The federal government has recognized that those electronic health records can generate enormous savings for the healthcare industry. They're going to save time. They're going to prevent a lot of errors that happen. And so the federal government has recognized this. Well, we need to look at what should an electronic health record contain. We have to look at it differently than a paper record, because electronic health record can hold so much more. And so when we're looking, we have to determine what the state and federal laws say as far as a medical record. What does it have to contain? But one way this is going to affect us is not only we'll go to a computer and look at a record. It can be sent over the internet. Patients can get their information off the web, those types of things, and that we don't have paper anymore. But if we don't have paper, some of those HIM functions that we talked about in 151 that we do, for example, abstracting. Abstracting is just taking that paper record and taking pertinent parts and inputting it into a computer, and then we can have reports generated, or the bills are generated from that information. But abstracting, if we don't have the paper to start with, then we won't do it the same way. We won't have to do it, because basically a software application program will be written to say, go to the electronic health record where this data is contained, and I need this, 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 and this. And so we won't have to abstract from the paper onto the computer. And so it'll automatically be captured. So it's going to change our lives in a lot of different ways, in the ways in which we do things. Now, Congress in many states have enacted laws that support the development and expanded use of the electronic health record. And one in particular, this Uniform Electronic Transactions Act, is a model act. And when I say model, it's one that's developed in hopes that other states will actually adopt this or put it into law. It's a model act that makes transactions in the electronic marketplace as enforceable as transactions on paper with manual signatures. And so notice that doesn't say anything about health, but still it's talking about the electronic marketplace, that electronic signatures are just as good as manual signatures. And that's what that act says. Some states have adopted it, some have not. Now, electronic health information systems. Now, these electronic health records maintained by healthcare providers, or the electronic health record, is a critical building block for an EHR system. And what I mean by a system, it's not just having an electronic health record, but being able to share that data among all the components of the healthcare delivery system. In HIT 153, we talked about all the components of a healthcare delivery system. That healthcare can be given in a lot of different places by a lot of different caregivers. And so many times patients will move from one type of facility to another. They may be in the hospital, and then they get their follow-up care somewhere else, or they may go into rehab, or they may see their personal physician. And so what we're talking about with the electronic health record system is allowing sharing of this electronic data on the patients among all of the individuals and facilities that will use it to continue to care for the patient. In 2004, President Bush called for the widespread adoption of an interoperable electronic health record within the next 10 years, and that was 10 years from 2004. And what was meant by interoperable is an electronic health record that permits the exchange of patient health information among desperate clinicians and other authorized entities in real time and under stringent security, privacy, and other protection. So that fits back to that EHR system. Not only have an electronic health record, but being able to, one of the major reasons to have one is to be able to share the information. And when we take interoperable, it's so that the systems are compatible, so that one individual or one facility that has the information needs to share it with another, that is possible because the systems are compatible. So that's what we mean by interoperable. But also with tight security, privacy taken into consideration, and protection of any of that information that's going to be transmitted electronically. Also, at that time, a position was created in the federal government called the National Health Information Technology Coordinator, and that job is for an individual whose responsibility is to guide and plan the implementation of this interoperable health information technology on the federal level. Now, with paper records, we have security issues and concerns, but with EHRs, it's a whole new ball game. Anytime we have anything that can be transmitted electronically or kept electronically, we have security concerns because these electronic health records can be vulnerable to computer viruses, can be vulnerable to sabotage, but not always intentional. How many have had their computer crash before? What if that happens with all of patients, or thousands and thousands of patients and their information? What happens? And so sometimes these things can be intentional, other times it's not intentional. So that's why it's so important. If we go to the electronic health record, and we use electronic health record system, that it be designed and installed and maintained in a manner that preserves the reliability of the records created and stored on the systems, so that the records will be admissible as evidence in court of law and will be credible. Because as it stands, medical records paper records are admissible as evidence in court. And so we have to make sure that the EHR records are maintained in a way that they can't be changed, that they're credible, that we know that what it was originally, it still is. And so that it is a legal document, and so we have to be aware of that in the design phase. And when it's installed, we have to take that into consideration and not have it as an after the fact thought. The data within the electronic health record has to be secure and also has to have integrity. Now, security can be defined as protecting the integrity, availability, confidentiality, and accountability of information system resources. Now, most of those other words, you know what they are as far as, the data has to be available. If you have health data in a system, you need to be able to access it. It needs to remain confidential. When we talk about accountability, we're talking about only those people who, we need to know who's accessing that information, and it should only be those individuals who have authority to do that. But let's kind of key in on integrity. And what I mean by integrity of the data means that the information is changed or altered only in a specified and authorized manner. And this relates back, this is part of security. So meaning what I said a minute ago, if something's put in and is part of an electronic health record, that data doesn't change, that it's in there, and that it can't be altered by an individual or by a mistake in a system or a computer, those types of things. So that's what integrity is. The data are secure when protected from improper disclosure or unauthorized or unintended alterations. Now let's look at some system security measures. And again, this is going to be basically repeated in your HIT 221, but there's a few differences here. I do realize that these technical safeguards are not in this chapter anymore, that they've been removed with the new edition of the book, but I thought they were important. And again, it never hurts to have things repeated, because that's how we tend to remember them. But just some of the technical safeguards that use to make sure that the data are secure in these electronic health records. Some of these you use all the time. You have a personal ID number to get you into a certain, for example, if you go to the ATM, not just anybody can walk up and get your money. Hopefully, you have to have that personal ID number. It's the same thing as user identification. It's a password or some type of user ID. That's the most common. But there can also, under that same category with a personal ID and user identification, instead of using a password, biometric identification can be used, and it involves verifying a unique physical feature of a user. And so instead of, if I walk up, instead of keying in a password, I can actually lay my hand down and it'll do a palm print, or I can have my voice recorded, or a fingerprint, a retinal scan, scans my eye. This is becoming more and more popular as it's becoming more and more affordable, because it used to be just outrageous, the prices, but just like everything else in technology, the longer it's out there, the less expensive it is. So that's biometric. The other is, just common passwords and are using a user ID. Now, access control software and audit trails. Access controls prevent a user from accessing or modifying a file unless authorized to do so. So once the person's in the system, then with their password or their identification, their biometric identification, then it doesn't give them free rein to go everywhere in a system. That people who work in a particular part of the hospital should not be able to log in and go to the medical record and look at it. Maybe people in the business office, we wouldn't have business in their records, and they wouldn't have business in the medical records that we keep. And so that's the system, once a password is given out, will identify that individual and let them go only to parts, only have access to parts of the system, and also may allow them in the system, but they can't change anything. And so that's what that access control is. Audit trails keep track of a user's activity. So every time somebody logs in with a password of 123456, it keeps track of when it was, where it was, what computer terminal, how long they were there, what they looked at, and that's kind of an after-the-fact thing. But audit trails just keep track of everybody that's been in a system and what they've accessed and what they've done. Now, computer architecture itself can have built-in security, so the computer itself. An example of this, logging off after it's been idle for a certain amount of time. You can log on to a system or do something, and if you don't do anything or input anything for a certain number of minutes, you may be automatically logged off. Or maybe not allowing somebody to try to get in the system after they put the password in wrong for the third time. I know at ATM, at some banks, it will take your ATM card away from you if you are not paying attention and put your password or your PIN number in wrong on the third time. It just keeps it. Communication linkage safeguards. What this is talking about is limiting the vulnerability for unauthorized access to a network system, meaning when computers are linked to each other and sharing information. Examples, or I know some systems you can call up from a remote location to get into a computer system, and some of the safeguards would be that you have to put a password in to get in, or could even be you have to go through an operator, and then the operator will dial you back before you can get in the system. So it's just extra safeguards. Now, encryption is encoding data for transmission and storage, meaning that if somebody did intercept it, that it's kind of put in spy code, and that if they did get it, they can't read it unless they are able to decrypt it. So encryption is encoding data for transmission or storage. Now, the biggest threat to computer security is often internal. If you have disgruntled employees, that's why it's so important, if anybody's ever let go, that immediately beforehand that password to the computer system is changed. But also things you wouldn't even suspect. Software vendors. Vendors may shut down a system over a payment issue. They may have a special little program in there that if they don't feel that they've received their payment as they should, that they'll just shut down the whole system. There should be contracts signed that totally prohibit this before the fact, and so that needs to be addressed before it could ever happen. And if it did happen, that contract should hold the vendor responsible for any damages that happen if they did this. Now, the HIPAA security rule, we had a whole presentation on HIPAA. And the new version of your textbook, I know in some things you'll hear me say in these presentations, well, that was before HIPAA or after HIPAA. We've got a brand new edition, as I'm recording this, that includes HIPAA in every chapter in the book. And so you have a particular presentation that says HIPAA that you have already watched and you've been tested on. That was on the HIPAA privacy rule. But HIPAA has different parts. There is also a HIPAA security rule, and the security rule is designed to protect the security of called ePHI, electronic health information, where the privacy rule was all of that protected health information. It didn't matter if it was paper or plastic. It applied to everything. But the security rule is strictly for the electronic health record. And I just want to point out that after April 2005, the security rule applied to most covered entities, but only to their receipt, creation, use, storage, and transmission of electronic PHI. The privacy rule applies to PHI in any form. And so the security rule established standards. When we say rule, I know that can sound confusing sometimes. It's a bunch of rules, but they just call it the HIPAA security rule and the HIPAA privacy rule, the different parts of HIPAA. But no, there's more than one rule. There's a lot of standards in here. But this was for, again, that ePHI, electronic PHI. And so together with the privacy rule, you have the security rule. It provides for comprehensive protection of a patient's health information, or protected health information. Now also I wanted to point out, now I'm not going over, we've already been over the privacy rule in detail. The security rule, again, another component of HIPAA. I'm going to cover that in HIT 221, the computer applications in HIT course. We'll go into that into detail, but I want you at this point to know that these are separate things, but they interconnect basically, and it's for the protection of the protected health information. Now, preserving access to computerized records. The federal government, Joint Commission, state licensing laws all say that medical records have to be readily accessible and promptly retrievable. And so, what do? If a system crashes or experiences downtime, records are not accessible. And so we have to think about that. What do we do? There has to be computer maintenance a lot of times, but the best way to deal with that is to make sure that downtime is at a minimum at off hours. You know, healthcare is 24 hours a day basically, but there are some hours that aren't as busy as at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. Also, there always needs to be backup. There needs to be copies of everything in the system in case there is a major crash and not everything's lost. So it's very important that backup is done often and that it's done and the computer is maintained, the system is maintained and done at off hours to make sure that the records are accessible as much as they can be. So the hardware and the software have to be maintained to make sure that there is not a crash in the system. And another thing that you have to think about are durability concerns. Normally when we talk about paper, we talk about durability. Different grades of paper last a certain numbers of years. And so if you needed a record to last 100 years, you'd pay high dollar for a high grade of paper. But we have to worry about that also with computerized records. They have to be durable enough to meet the retention requirements. When we talk about retention requirements, how long do we have to keep them? And so if we say we're going to keep them for 10 years or 20 years or however long we're required, plus, you know, however long our policies say that we're going to retain medical records, we have to make sure that what we're keeping them on is durable. And you know how computers get obsolete so fast, and computer systems do, so that's something we have to think about. If we have it saved in a certain form, are we going to be able to access the information for that time period that we're required to keep the records? And so two things we have to consider, these two durability concerns. That the medium, just meaning what's it kept on, what are we keeping it on? The medium must last for the minimum retention time. So it could be on an optical disc. And so we have to make sure we know that that optical disc is going to last for a certain amount of time. And obsolete equipment may need to be maintained. And so we may have an old system that we have to maintain because it holds our patient data that we are supposed to retain for a certain number of years. And I can only equate this to, you know, if you had something saved on this is for something that's happening, and I know that when I purchased the last computer that I got not too long ago, there's no floppy on there. You know, if you have things saved on a floppy drive, then you're just out of luck. Now, you can get one that connects with a USB port, but that used to be just, that's where we kept everything on little floppy drives, and that wasn't too many years ago at all. And then now, you buy a computer, it doesn't even have a floppy drive. So the assumption is you're going to be keeping it on a CD or a DVD. And then we use the stick drives, little flash drives, those types of things. And so if we had information, and like I said, I'm just trying to equate this as far as these durability concerns, just because we have it on something doesn't mean we can actually get to it. And so we have to take that in consideration, which may cause us to have to keep obsolete equipment in working order for the retention period. Now, accuracy issues with computerized records, just like in paper-based records, they have to be completed in a timely manner and they have to be accurate. Now, errors in computer records can result from defective performance of hardware and or software. So with paper, it's usually an individual has written something in the record wrong. And we've talked about correcting errors by writing something, a line through the error and, initialing it and putting the correct information. But errors in the computerized records can happen. A system, there can be a virus or defective hardware that can change things in the system, so we have to make sure with health records that that's not happening. So again, regular maintenance to ensure proper working, and that regular maintenance could be to make sure that we have all the security and safety precautions on there that we could possibly have, as far as, if we're talking about like if it was our home computer, it'd be our virus check up to date and things, but it's a lot more sophisticated with the bigger systems. But I'm talking about those types of things to make sure that the equipment is working properly, both the hardware and the software, to make sure that the data that's in there remains accurate. Now, electronic records as evidence in court. An electronic health record is made in the ordinary or normal course of business, and it should meet the business record exception to the hearsay rule. Now, what's hearsay? Everybody's heard that term. Hearsay is a statement made by a person who is not present in the court and is generally inadmissible or can't be used as evidence unless it meets one of the exceptions to the hearsay rule. Now, medical records are hearsay in that they're made outside of court. They're statements written in a record made outside of court. So that would make them hearsay. But medical records do meet an exception. There is an exception to this hearsay rule. And the hearsay rule just says, hey, you can't use that. That's a statement you made out of court that we can't prove. So the medical records meet what's called the business records exception to the hearsay rule. And all business records that were made in the normal course of business and not prepared specifically for the trial would meet the exception, and they would be admissible as evidence in court. The medical record is a business record because it keeps the business of the institution and the treatment that's given to the patient. It's a record. It's made at the time that the treatment is given, and so it is a business record, and it meets the exception to that hearsay rule. So medical records are admissible as evidence in court. Now, there's also something called the best evidence rule. And best evidence rule expresses a preference, a judicial preference, so a preference in court, for the original of a writing if the contents are in question. And so, in regard to paper, we know what the original is versus a copy of something, but the original record would be the best evidence. And that's only if it's in question. I've said we make copies of medical records and we can send them to court with a certification. But if there was any question as to that copy, then the best evidence would be the original medical record, and that's why sometimes we have to take the original to court. Now, when we're talking about an electronic health record, what is the best evidence? What is the original of an electronic record? Is a hard copy that's printed, is that considered the original record? Because that's usually what we do. We hit the print button and we can print things out. Now, there are federal rules of evidence that state if data are stored on a computer or a similar device, any printout or other output readable by sight shown to reflect the data accurately is considered an original. And so you can have with electronic records, anytime you hit the print button, you have a new original of the record, and that's what those are saying, that yes, that is considered an original as far as that best evidence rule. And so anytime you have a printed copy, then that is an original of a computerized record. Okay, that's the end of just a brief discussion on the electronic health record. It's a topic that will be brought up basically in every class you're taking. We talk about the electronic health record and its effects in all of the different areas of health information management.